When a group of bikers stumbled upon an isolated ice fishing shack, they thought it would be the perfect spot to cause some trouble. Little did they know that the man inside wasn't just an ordinary fisherman, he was a highly trained soldier. What began as harmless taunting soon escalated, but they quickly realized they had picked the wrong man to mess with. The ice was thick enough to hold a truck, stretching endlessly under the pale winter sun. Iron Mike Carter didn't need much, just his fishing gear, a thermos of coffee, and the peace of the frozen wilderness. In the center of the lake, his shack stood sturdy, weathered by years of snow and storms. Mike pulled his parka tighter, adjusting the military patches on his sleeve, a habit rather than a statement. His world had been loud once, filled with the chaos of war. Now, he cherished the silence, until he heard them. The growl of motorcycles shattered the serenity, echoing over the ice. Mike froze, his hand gripping a fishing rod. He turned toward the shore, where a group of 6 bikers parked haphazardly, their leather jackets and tattoos clashing with the pristine snow. Their leader, a tall man with a scar down his cheek, strutted toward the shack, grinning. "Hey, Pops!" the man shouted, kicking snow off his boots as he approached. "Looks like you've got yourself a cozy little setup here." Mike said nothing, his calm gaze steady as he watched the gang file into his space, tracking every movement. The leader grabbed a stool and sat, scanning the shack. "Name's Trey. My boys and I were looking for a spot to hang out. Looks like we just found it." A shorter, wiry man spotted a small military medal on Mike's shelf. "Hey, look at this. Old man's some kind of hero." He grabbed it, tossing it carelessly between his hands. Mike's jaw tightened. "Put that down." The words, quiet and measured, silenced the laughter for a moment. Trey smirked. "What if we don't?" Mike stood slowly, his movements deliberate. The bikers instinctively stepped back, sensing the shift in his presence. Trey's smirk faltered as Mike's steely gaze locked onto his. "I'm giving you one chance," Mike said evenly. "Take your friends and leave." Trey chuckled nervously. "Or what, Grandpa? You gonna fish us to death?" Mike stepped closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You don't want to find out." The silence that followed was louder than any threat. For the first time, the bikers realized they'd made a mistake. The tension hung heavy in the air, like the calm before a storm. Trey's smirk returned, but it wasn't as confident this time. He gestured to the wiry biker, still holding Mike's medal. "Come on, Pete. Give the old man his trinket back. We don't want him crying over his glory days." Pete tossed the medal onto the floor with a clink, grinning as he turned back toward the others. But his grin faltered when Mike didn't move to pick it up. Instead, Mike's piercing stare followed him like a hunter tracking prey. Pete shifted uncomfortably. "You got something to say, old-timer?" Trey said, stepping closer to Mike, his bravado swelling in front of his crew. "Or are you just going to stand there pretending to scare us?" Mike didn't blink. His calm expression didn't change, but his words cut like ice. "You boys are too dumb to understand what's coming." Trey's face twisted in mock outrage. "You think you're tougher than us? Just because you've got some old soldier stories rattling around in that head of yours?" The other bikers laughed nervously, their voices echoing inside the cramped shack. One of them, a stocky man with a thick beard, leaned on the counter and cracked his knuckles. "Bet this geezer hasn't thrown a punch in years," he said. "Probably break his hip if he tried." Mike's hand twitched almost imperceptibly, but he stayed rooted to the spot. His calm demeanor was unshakable, like the ice beneath their feet. "I'll give you some advice," Mike said softly. "Take your bikes. Leave now. And count yourselves lucky that you don't know the man you're dealing with." Trey laughed louder this time, stepping directly into Mike's space. "You don't scare me, Grandpa. In fact..." He grabbed the fishing rod from Mike's hand and snapped it cleanly over his knee. "I think you've got about 5 seconds to apologize before we make ourselves real comfortable." The shack grew impossibly quiet, the kind of silence that preceded disaster. Mike's gaze dropped briefly to the broken rod, then back to Trey's face. "Last warning," Mike said. His voice was so calm it sent a chill through the room. Trey chuckled and turned to his crew. "Did you hear that? Grandpa's warning us again. Someone get him his cane so he can really threaten us." The bikers roared with laughter, their confidence returning as they fed off each other's energy. Pete leaned back against the wall, kicking over a small wooden box filled with fishing supplies. Hooks and lines spilled onto the floor. "Oops," Pete said, feigning innocence. "Guess I'm clumsy." Mike didn't move. His expression didn't change, but his next words carried a weight that silenced the room again. "You just made the worst mistake of your life." Trey's grin faltered, but he quickly recovered. "Oh yeah? And what are you going to do about it, old man?" Mike finally stepped forward, closing the distance between them. The bikers instinctively backed up, their laughter dying in their throats as Mike loomed closer. Despite his lean frame and weathered appearance, there was something unshakably dangerous about him. "I'm not going to do anything," Mike said. "You've already done it." The air in the shack grew colder, and for the first time, Trey's cocky exterior cracked. He turned to his crew, motioning toward the door. "Come on, boys. Let's see what Grandpa's hiding in that truck of his." Mike's lips pressed into a thin line, but he didn't stop them. He simply watched as the bikers filed out, their boots crunching on the snow. Trey lingered for a moment, smirking as he jabbed a finger into Mike's chest. "We'll be back, old man. And next time, we're going to take more than just your shack." Trey sauntered out, slamming the door behind him. Mike waited until the roar of their motorcycles faded into the distance before moving. He bent down, picked up the metal Pete had thrown, and dusted it off. For a long moment, he stared at it, the weight of the past pressing heavily on his shoulders. He turned and walked to the small wood-burning stove in the corner of the shack. From the drawer beneath it, he pulled out a metal box, unlocked it, and flipped the lid open. Inside was a small arsenal, a knife, several lengths of cord, and a compact radio transmitter. Mike set the box on the table, his expression unreadable. He placed the metal inside the box, closed it, and reached for the radio. "It's Carter," he said into the transmitter. His voice was steady, controlled. "I've got a situation. Prep the protocols." Static crackled on the other end before a voice replied. "Understood. What's the severity?" Mike's eyes narrowed. "High. This is going to get messy." He switched off the radio and leaned back, his fingers steepled in thought. Outside, the wind howled over the frozen lake, but Mike didn't hear it. His mind was already working, calculating his next move. The bikers thought they were in control. They thought they'd scared an old man, but they didn't know who they'd just picked a fight with. The moon hung high over the frozen lake, casting a ghostly glow across the endless snow. The bikers, loud and boisterous earlier, were now scattered around a makeshift camp near the tree line. Trey leaned against a log, a beer in one hand, and a smirk on his face as he watched Pete toss rocks at the frozen lake. "Did you see the look on that old man's face?" Pete laughed, throwing another rock. "Thought he was going to cry when I smashed his stuff." "He's harmless," said Max, the stocky biker with the thick beard. He sat by the fire, poking at it with a stick. "Probably ran off to call the sheriff or something." Trey laughed, loud and mocking. "Let him call whoever he wants. By the time they show up, this whole lake'll be ours. That shack's prime real estate for the boys." The others chuckled, their confidence bolstered by Trey's swagger. They were so caught up in their bravado that they didn't notice the shadow moving at the edge of the woods. Mike crouched low behind a snowbank, his breath steady despite the freezing air. His years of training had conditioned him for moments like this, where patience and precision mattered more than brute force. He'd watched the bikers settle in, cataloging their movements, noting who seemed to follow Trey's lead and who might falter under pressure. He glanced at the compact device in his hand, a small, portable motion detector he'd rigged from his military days. The grid on the screen showed the bikers' positions, their movements sluggish from alcohol and overconfidence. Mike smiled faintly. He'd seen men like them before, arrogant, unprepared, and overconfident. They had no idea the predator lurking just beyond the firelight. "Yo, Trey," Pete called out, tossing another rock. "You think the old man's shack has any food in it? I'm starving." Trey rolled his eyes. "If you want food, go get it yourself, idiot. You scared of Grandpa sneaking up on you?" The group roared with laughter, and Pete muttered something under his breath. He grabbed a flashlight from his pack and started trudging toward the shack. "Don't get lost," Max called out, chuckling as Pete disappeared into the darkness. Mike waited until Pete was halfway to the shack before he moved. Silently, he circled wide, using the trees and snowdrifts for cover. Pete's flashlight bobbed erratically as he grumbled to himself, his boots crunching loudly in the snow. Mike stepped into the biker's path, staying just outside the beam of light. When Pete was close enough, Mike moved, fast and silent as a shadow. He clamped a hand over Pete's mouth, dragging him backward into the snowbank before the biker could cry out. Pete struggled, but Mike's grip was ironclad. He leaned in close, his voice low and lethal. "You're going to sleep now. When you wake up, you'll wish you hadn't." Pete's eyes widened in terror before Mike applied just enough pressure to knock him out. He laid the unconscious biker in the snow, securing him with zip ties from his pack. A length of duct tape over Pete's mouth ensured silence. One down. Back at the camp, the fire crackled, and the bikers were getting restless. Trey glanced toward the shack, irritation flickering across his face. "What's taking Pete so long?" Trey growled, tossing his empty beer can into the snow. "Probably stuffing his face with whatever he found," Max replied with a shrug. "You know how he is." Trey stood, his patience wearing thin. "I'll go check on him. Max, you're in charge." Max raised his beer in mock salute as Trey grabbed a flashlight and started toward the shack. Mike watched from the shadows as Trey approached. The leader's cocky swagger was more subdued now, his flashlight sweeping the area in sharp arcs. Mike could see the tension in his movements. Trey was starting to sense that something wasn't right. Good, Mike thought. Let him feel it. Trey reached the edge of the shack and called out, "Pete! Where the hell are you?" No answer. "Pete, quit screwing around!" Trey barked, stepping closer. He peered through the window of the shack, seeing nothing but darkness. Frustrated, he turned to head back to camp. That's when Mike struck. With a swift motion, Mike stepped out from behind a snowbank and yanked Trey's flashlight from his hand. The biker spun around, but Mike's fist connected with his gut before he could react. Trey doubled over, wheezing, as Mike grabbed him by the collar and slammed him against the wall of the shack. "You think this is a game?" Mike growled, his face inches from Trey's. "You're out of your depth, kid." Trey's eyes widened in shock as he got his first real look at Mike's expression. Calm, controlled, and utterly unyielding. Trey swung a desperate punch, but Mike blocked it effortlessly, twisting Trey's arm behind his back and forcing him to his knees. "You picked the wrong man to mess with," Mike said, his voice low and cold. "And now you're going to pay for it." Trey's bravado crumbled, replaced by fear as Mike pulled zip ties from his pocket and secured Trey's wrists. He leaned in close, his words deliberate. "Your boys don't know it yet, but this is over." Back at the camp, Max threw another log on the fire, grumbling to himself. "What's taking those two idiots so long?" He looked around at the remaining bikers. "You two, go find them. I'm not sitting here all night waiting for them to play hide and seek." The remaining bikers grumbled but grabbed flashlights and headed off toward the shack. Mike watched them approach, a faint smile playing on his lips. They were walking into the same trap as their leader. One by one, the pieces were falling into place. The fire at the bikers' camp crackled steadily as Max leaned against a log sipping from a beer can. His breath misted in the frigid air, and a faint unease prickled at the edges of his drunken haze. He glanced at the tree line where two of his men had disappeared minutes earlier to look for Trey and Pete. "Idiots," he muttered, kicking at a pile of snow. "Can't even find their way back without holding hands." Behind him, the last two bikers, Roy and Jace, sat quietly, fiddling with the knives they always carried. They weren't exactly talkative, but tonight their silence carried an edge. The longer their friends were gone, the heavier the tension became. "You think they're okay?" Jace asked, his voice barely audible over the crackle of the flames. Max waved him off. "They're fine, probably stuffing their faces with whatever that old man had in his shack." But even as he said it, his eyes darted again toward the dark trees, his confidence waning. Further away, Mike moved like a shadow through the forest, following the two bikers, Tommy and Dean, who were noisily making their way toward the shack. Their flashlights bobbed unevenly, and their laughter was forced, an obvious attempt to mask their growing discomfort. You see anything? Tommy asked, glancing nervously at Dean. Nothing yet, Dean replied, though his grip on his flashlight tightened. This is stupid. Pete and Trey are probably passed out drunk in the shack. Yeah, well, if they are, I'm kicking their asses for making us come out here in this cold, Tommy grumbled, stamping his boots against the snow. Mike watched from a ridge above them, crouched low to remain unseen. His breath was steady, measured, as he assessed the situation. These two were amateurs, arrogant and careless. He could handle them easily. The plan was already forming in his mind. The bikers trudged closer to the shack, their muttered complaints cutting through the stillness of the night. They reached the edge of the clearing where the structure stood silent and foreboding under the moonlight. You go check inside, Tommy said, motioning toward the shack. I'll look around out here. Dean hesitated. Why don't you check inside and I'll— Just do it, man, Tommy snapped. We're wasting time. Dean sighed and started toward the shack, muttering curses under his breath. Mike waited until Tommy was alone, scanning the perimeter. Then, with practiced precision, he moved. Tommy felt a hand clamp over his mouth and was yanked backward into the darkness before he could make a sound. His flashlight hit the snow with a muffled thud, its beam scattering erratically. Mike maneuvered Tommy effortlessly, pinning him against a tree. His knife gleamed in the moonlight as he held it to the biker's throat. Make a sound, and you'll regret it, Mike whispered, his voice calm and deadly. Tommy froze, his eyes wide with fear. Mike secured him quickly, zip-tying his wrists and gagging him before dragging him behind a snowbank where Trey and Pete were already bound and unconscious. You're not as tough as you think, Mike muttered, glancing at the growing pile of restrained bikers. He straightened, moving back toward the clearing where Dean was still poking around. Dean pushed open the shack door cautiously, his flashlight sweeping the interior. Trey, he called out. Pete, you guys in here? The shack was eerily silent, the only sound the faint creak of wood as the wind pressed against it. Come on, stop screwing around. Dean stepped inside, his flashlight illuminating the sparse interior. Fishing gear lay scattered on the floor, along with an overturned chair and a broken rod. He turned toward a dark corner, where a shadow moved. Who's there? Dean demanded, his voice cracking. The shadow shifted, and Dean swung his flashlight toward it. Too late. Mike lunged from the corner, disarming Dean with a single fluid motion. The flashlight clattered to the ground, plunging them into semi-darkness. Before Dean could react, Mike had him on the floor, zip-tying his wrists with the same efficiency he'd used on the others. You picked the wrong shack, Mike said evenly, standing over the struggling man. You should have stayed home. Dean shouted something muffled and incoherent, thrashing against the ties, but Mike ignored him. He dragged Dean out of the shack and deposited him with the others. The pile of restrained bikers was growing, their cocky bravado replaced with stunned disbelief. Back at the camp, Max was pacing now, his earlier confidence completely eroded. This isn't right, he muttered, glancing toward the tree line. Where the hell is everybody? Roy shrugged, his knife glinting in the firelight as he carved absent-mindedly into a piece of wood. They probably got lost or found something better to do. Lost? On a flat, frozen lake? Max snapped. They're not lost. They're screwing around. Jay stood, slipping his knife into its sheath. Then let's go find them. Max nodded reluctantly. Yeah, fine. Let's go. The two of them started toward the trees, their flashlights slicing through the darkness. Mike watched them approach, his lips curling into a faint smile. These two were different, slightly more cautious, slightly more competent, but it wouldn't save them. Max stopped abruptly, his flashlight illuminating something half buried in the snow. It was Tommy's flashlight, abandoned and flickering weakly. What the hell? Max muttered, crouching to pick it up. That's not good, Jay said, scanning the area nervously. Max straightened, his expression hardening. Whoever's messing with us is going to regret it. From the shadows, Mike stepped into view, his posture calm but imposing. Looking for your friends? He said coolly. Max and Jay spun toward the voice, their flashlights finding Mike's figure. You, Max snarled, stepping forward. Where are they? Mike tilted his head. You'll see them soon enough. Max charged, but Mike was ready. In one swift motion, he sidestepped, grabbing Max's wrist and twisting it until the flashlight fell to the ground. He drove an elbow into Max's gut, sending him sprawling into the snow. Jace hesitated, his knife half drawn, before lunging. Mike deflected the blade with a quick block, disarming Jace with ease. A well-placed kick sent him sprawling beside Max. Both bikers groaned, clutching their injuries as Mike loomed over them. "You came looking for trouble," Mike said, his voice steady. "Now you've found it." By the time Mike dragged Max and Jace to the growing pile of restrained bikers, the fire at their camp was dying down. Mike crouched in front of Trey, whose furious glare couldn't hide his fear. "This is what happens when you underestimate people," Mike said calmly. "You might want to remember that." Trey spat at the ground, his bravado flickering. "You're dead, old man. You hear me? You're dead." Mike stood, unaffected by the threat. He turned and walked back toward the shack, leaving the gang bound and defeated in the snow. And as he disappeared into the darkness, Trey and his crew realized just how badly they'd miscalculated. The bikers huddled together in the snow, their bonds tight, their breaths misting in the freezing night air. Trey struggled against the zip ties holding his wrists, his face twisted with fury. Around him, his men were silent, the weight of their situation finally sinking in. "This is bull," Trey growled, his voice low but heated. "We're gonna make that old man pay. He thinks he's untouchable?" Max, nursing a bruised rib from Mike's earlier takedown, shook his head. "Face it, Trey. He's not just some old guy. He took all of us down like we were nothing." Trey glared at Max. "You scared of him now? You gonna run back to Mommy?" Max stiffened but didn't reply. The truth was obvious to everyone except Trey. They'd been outmatched from the start. Inside the shack, Mike calmly sipped from a thermos of coffee, his breathing steady despite the night's exertions. His small radio buzzed with static, and then a voice came through. "Carter, status report," the voice said, clipped and professional. Mike pressed the button to respond. "Situation under control. No casualties, but they're shaken up. Might be enough to scare them off for good." "Do you need backup?" Mike's eyes flicked toward the window, where the bikers' makeshift campfire was little more than glowing embers. He could see the dark shapes of the restrained men huddled together, their bravado extinguished. "Negative," Mike replied. "They're no real threat now. Just a bunch of punks who thought they could intimidate the wrong guy." The voice on the other end hesitated before replying. "Understood, but keep us updated if they escalate." "Will do," Mike said, switching off the radio. Outside, the bikers' frustration reached a boiling point. "I'm not sitting here all night like some loser," Jace muttered, his teeth chattering. "We've got to do something." Trey twisted his wrists harder against the zip ties, gritting his teeth. "We wait for our chance. He's gonna slip up, and when he does, we'll make him regret ever touching us." Pete, his face pale from fear and the cold, shook his head. "No way, man, we're done. Let's just cut our losses and get the hell out of here." "You want to run away?" Trey snapped. "You gonna let that old man walk all over us?" Pete hesitated but didn't reply. The truth was, running seemed like the only option. Mike stepped out of the shack, his boots crunching in the snow. He carried a lantern in one hand and a long knife in the other, its blade gleaming in the moonlight. The sight of him approaching made the bikers stiffen. Trey's eyes burned with defiance, but the rest of the gang couldn't hide their fear. "All right," Mike said calmly, stopping a few feet away from the group. "Here's how this is going to go." He crouched down, meeting Trey's glare head-on. "You and your boys are going to leave this lake. You're going to pack up whatever's left of your camp, get on your bikes, and never come back." Trey spat into the snow at Mike's feet. "You think you scare me? You're just a washed-up has-been trying to play soldier." Mike tilted his head, his expression unreadable. "You're brave, I'll give you that. Stupid, but brave." He stood and began pacing slowly in front of the bikers, his voice even but cold. "Do you know what makes a man dangerous? It's not the muscles, the tattoos, or the attitude. It's the patience, the experience, the ability to wait and strike when the time is right." He stopped and turned to Trey, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "I've fought men who would make you cry just by looking at you, and they didn't scare me. Do you think you do? Trey's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Here's the deal, Mike continued, raising his voice so the whole group could hear. You leave now and this ends here. But if I see any of you back here, or if you try to retaliate, I'll come looking for you. And trust me when I say, you don't want me to come looking. The silence that followed was deafening. Even Trey's bravado seemed to crack under the weight of Mike's words. Cut us loose, Trey said finally, his voice low. We'll go. Mike stared at him for a long moment, weighing his sincerity. Then he stepped forward, slicing through the zip ties holding Trey's wrists. One by one, he freed the rest of the gang, his movements quick and efficient. Trey rubbed his wrists, glaring at Mike. This isn't over, he muttered under his breath. Mike didn't flinch. It is if you're smart. He stepped back, watching as the bikers gathered their belongings and headed for their bikes. None of them looked back, but Mike could feel their anger simmering beneath the surface. As the roar of their motorcycles faded into the night, Mike stood alone in the snow, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He knew men like Trey didn't forget humiliation easily. This wasn't over, not yet. But when they came back, if they came back, Mike would be ready. And this time, he wouldn't show restraint. The bikers rode through the night, their engines roaring against the stillness of the frozen wilderness. The gang was silent, their earlier bravado drained after their encounter with Mike. Even Trey, their leader, seemed lost in thought, gripping his handlebars with white-knuckled intensity. As they approached their clubhouse, a dilapidated warehouse on the outskirts of town, the group began to mutter among themselves. You really think we're just going to let him get away with that? Jace asked, his voice low. Pete, still pale and shaken, replied, We should. That guy's not normal. He tied us up like we were kids. He's just a guy, Trey snapped, cutting off the discussion. An old man with a lot of tricks, sure, but he's still just a man. He's not untouchable. Max, who had been quiet the entire ride, finally spoke up. You didn't see his eyes, Trey. That's not a guy you mess with again. He warned us for a reason. Trey brought his bike to a screeching halt outside the clubhouse, kicking the stand down with unnecessary force. He turned to face the group, his scarred face twisted in anger. Are you saying we just let him win? Let him humiliate us like that? He barked. You want to go back to being nobodies in this town? The gang exchanged uneasy glances. None of them wanted to admit it, but Trey's words stung. For years, they had ruled the area, feared by the locals. Now, an old man had dismantled them in one night. We go back, Trey said firmly. We go back and we finish this. No more games, no more warnings. We'll show him who's in charge. Back at the lake, Mike stood in the doorway of his shack, watching the horizon. The night had grown colder, the stars bright and clear against the dark sky. He didn't need the motion detector to know the bikers would return. Men like Trey couldn't handle defeat. Their pride wouldn't let them walk away. Mike stepped inside and closed the door, locking it behind him. He moved quickly, gathering supplies from the metal box under the table. His fingers brushed over a small photograph tucked into the corner of the box. A younger version of himself, standing with his unit in a war-torn desert. Not tonight, Mike muttered to the ghosts of his past as he set the picture aside. Tonight wasn't about memories. It was about survival. He pulled out a compact hunting rifle, a weapon he had hoped never to use again, and checked its condition. Next, he set up tripwires around the perimeter of the shack, each one connected to small but effective traps, flashbang grenades rigged to stun, not kill. Mike wasn't looking for bloodshed. He wanted to send a message. At the clubhouse, Trey sat at a table, sketching a crude map of the lake and shack on a torn piece of paper. The other bikers stood around him, their unease palpable. We'll hit him from 3 sides, Trey explained, pointing to the map. Me, Max, and Jace will go in from the south. Pete and Roy will flank him from the west. He won't see it coming. What if he's ready for us? Max asked hesitantly. Trey slammed his fist on the table. Then we show him what happens when you mess with us. I don't care what it takes. He's done. The gang reluctantly nodded, though doubt lingered in their eyes. The sound of engines returned hours later, echoing across the frozen lake. Mike stood by the window of his shack, his rifle resting on the sill. His breath fogged the glass as he watched the headlights approaching in the distance. "Here we go," he muttered, his voice calm. The bikers killed their engines near the tree line, moving cautiously on foot. Trey motioned for silence, leading his men forward in a crouched formation. The moonlight illuminated their figures, and Mike tracked each of them with practiced precision. He waited until they were within range of the first tripwire before he made his move. With a flick of his wrist, Mike triggered the trap. A blinding flash erupted in the darkness, followed by a deafening bang. The bikers shouted in confusion, stumbling back as the light temporarily blinded them. "What the hell?" Trey yelled, covering his eyes. Before they could recover, Mike moved silently through the trees, flanking them with the agility of a predator. He fired a warning shot into the air, the sound echoing like thunder across the frozen expanse. "Go home," Mike's voice rang out, cold and commanding. "This is your last chance." The bikers froze, fear etched into their faces. But Trey, fueled by rage, raised his voice. "Come out and fight, you coward," he shouted. "Face us like a man." Mike didn't answer. Instead, he triggered a second trap, a net rigged to a low branch that sprang up, ensnaring Pete and lifting him off the ground. The biker screamed, flailing helplessly as the net swung above the snow. "Pete!" Roy yelled, running toward his trapped friend. Mike's voice cut through the chaos. "Keep coming and you'll end up like him, or worse." Jace turned to Trey, panic in his eyes. "Trey, we can't win this. Let's get out of here." "No!" Trey barked. "We don't back down." But the gang was breaking. Max and Roy took a step back, their weapons shaking in their hands. Even Jace lowered his knife, his confidence shattered. "Trey," Max said, his voice trembling. "He's not playing around. He's gonna kill us if we stay." Trey's glare burned with frustration, but he couldn't deny the truth. Mike had outsmarted them again, and this time, the consequences were far more severe. Finally, Trey threw his knife into the snow, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "Fine," he shouted into the darkness. "You win, old man. We're leaving." Mike watched from the shadows as the bikers retreated, their heads low and their movements unsteady. He didn't follow them. He didn't need to. As the sound of their footsteps faded, Mike stepped out of the trees and dismantled the remaining traps. He glanced at the still swinging net, where Pete hung like a fly caught in a web. "Don't come back," Mike said quietly as he cut the net down, letting Pete drop unceremoniously into the snow. The biker scrambled to his feet and ran, not daring to look back. Hours later, as the first light of dawn broke over the lake, Mike sat on the steps of his shack, his rifle resting across his knees. The world was silent again, the snow untouched except for the tracks of the fleeing bikers. Mike knew they wouldn't return, not after tonight. But deep down, he also knew this wasn't the last time trouble would find him. For now, though, he let himself enjoy the quiet, his breath mingling with the cold morning air. The morning was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that seemed to hold its breath, as if the frozen lake itself was watching. Mike sat on the steps of his shack, his gaze sweeping over the vast expanse of snow and ice. The faint tire tracks left by the fleeing bikers had already started to disappear under the drifting snow. He'd won for now. Mike took a slow breath, the crisp air biting his lungs. He wasn't naive enough to think the ordeal was over. Men like Trey weren't the type to admit defeat. They'd sulk, lick their wounds, and then come back meaner and more dangerous. But this time, Mike suspected, they wouldn't return alone. He stood, stretching his stiff muscles, and headed inside. There was work to be done. The air inside the bikers' dilapidated warehouse was thick with tension. Trey sat at a long, scarred table, nursing his wounded pride as the rest of the gang skulked in the corners, avoiding his gaze. The defeat they had suffered at Mike's hands was a wound none of them could shake. "He made fools of us," Trey muttered, his voice low and venomous. Max leaned against the wall, his arms crossed. "We should have listened to you, Trey. You said he was just an old man, but he's—" Trey slammed his fist on the table, silencing him. "I don't care what he is. He doesn't get to humiliate us and walk away." The group shifted uncomfortably. Roy spoke up hesitantly. Maybe we should just let it go, Trey. Cut our losses before someone gets seriously hurt. Trey's glare was sharp enough to cut glass. No way. This isn't about some stupid fishing shack anymore. It's about respect. If we let him win, we lose everything we've built. He stood, pacing like a caged animal. But we're not going back alone this time. I know someone who can help us put him in his place. The gang exchanged uneasy glances, but none of them dared challenge Trey's decision. Mike worked methodically, dismantling his traps and re-securing the perimeter of the shack. His instincts told him the bikers would be back, but this time they'd bring reinforcements. He needed to be ready. He reached for the small radio transmitter on his table and adjusted the frequency. It was time to call in a favor. The static crackled and then a familiar voice came through. "Carter, haven't heard from you in a while." "Tomlin," Mike said evenly. "I've got a situation. A group of bikers I sent packing might be coming back with more firepower. Locals? Mostly, but I wouldn't be surprised if they call in some outside muscle." Tomlin sighed. "What do you need from me?" "Intel. I need to know who their allies are and how fast they can mobilize." There was a pause on the other end. "You're sure you don't want me to send backup?" "Not yet," Mike replied. "I don't want this turning into a war zone unless it has to." "Understood. I'll see what I can dig up." Mike clicked off the radio and sat back, his mind racing. He didn't like involving anyone else in his fights, but he knew this was bigger than him now. Trey's ego wouldn't let him walk away quietly. That afternoon, a black SUV rolled into the clubhouse parking lot, its dark windows glinting in the winter sun. Trey and his men stepped outside, their breath fogging in the cold as they watched the vehicle come to a stop. The driver's door opened, and a man stepped out. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a scar running down one side of his face. Unlike Trey's gang, who wore leather jackets and scruffy jeans, this man was dressed in a clean black coat, his movements precise and deliberate. "Mr. Locke?" Trey greeted, trying to mask his nervousness. "Call me Victor," the man said, his voice smooth but cold. He glanced around, taking in the rundown clubhouse and the gang of bruised and battered bikers. "You said you had a problem?" Trey nodded. "An old guy out at the lake. He's ex-military, real dangerous. Took us down like we were nothing." Victor raised an eyebrow. "And you want my help to... what? Rough him up? Make him disappear?" Trey hesitated, realizing the man's casual tone masked something far more lethal. "We just need him out of the way." Victor's lips curved into a faint smile. "I'll take care of it, but my services don't come cheap." Trey waved him off. "Money's not an issue. Just get it done." Victor nodded once, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Consider it handled." Mike was cleaning his rifle when he felt it, a subtle shift in the air, the kind of thing only someone with his experience could sense. He stood, his eyes scanning the windows. The snow outside glowed faintly under the moonlight, and all seemed quiet. Too quiet. Mike grabbed his rifle and moved toward the door, his steps silent despite the creaking floorboards. He opened the door slowly, the cold air biting his face as he stepped out onto the porch. He saw nothing at first, but then in the distance a shadow shifted near the tree line. Mike's grip tightened on the rifle as he took a few careful steps forward. "If you're looking for trouble," he called out, his voice calm but firm, "you found it." For a moment there was no response. Then a low voice drifted from the darkness. "I'm not like those boys you sent packing," Victor said, stepping into the open. "I'm here to settle this properly." Mike studied the man, his sharp instincts already analyzing every detail, the way Victor carried himself, the subtle bulge under his coat that hinted at a weapon. "I don't want trouble," Mike said evenly. "But if you've come to start something, I'll finish it." Victor chuckled, the sound low and dangerous. "I was hoping you'd say that." The game was changing. Mike wasn't facing amateurs anymore. This was a professional, a predator like himself, and the stakes had just been raised. Mike stood firm on the frozen ground, his rifle aimed squarely at Victor, whose calm demeanor was unnerving. The snowy expanse around them seemed to hold its breath as the two men sized each other up. "Listen," Mike said, his voice steady. "You don't have to do this. Walk away now, and no one gets hurt." Victor smirked, pulling back his coat to reveal a sleek pistol holstered at his side. "You know it's not that simple. Trey's paying me a lot to deal with you, and I don't leave jobs unfinished." Mike nodded, his gaze unwavering. "You're a professional. So am I. But you're in my world now." Victor's eyes narrowed. "Show me." Before Victor could reach for his weapon, Mike disappeared into the trees, moving with practiced ease. Victor's expression flickered with surprise, but he quickly recovered, drawing his pistol and scanning the shadows. The first trap went off with a deafening bang, a flashbang grenade rigged to disorient. Victor stumbled, shielding his eyes as Mike's voice echoed through the trees. "You're out of your element," Mike called, his tone calm. "You should have walked away." Victor regained his composure, his sharp instincts kicking in. "Clever," he muttered, moving cautiously through the snow. Mike watched from above, perched in a tree like a hawk surveying its prey. He waited until Victor stepped into the next trap, a tripwire that sent a heavy branch swinging toward him. Victor dodged at the last second, but the movement left him exposed. Mike fired a warning shot, the bullet striking the ground inches from Victor's feet. "You can still leave," Mike said. "You've seen enough to know how this ends." Victor gritted his teeth. "Not a chance." Victor moved with calculated precision, using the cover of trees and snowdrifts to close the distance between them. He wasn't a mindless thug like the bikers. He was trained, disciplined, and relentless. But so was Mike. The two men circled each other in the dark, exchanging blows of strategy and skill. Victor fired twice, the shots whizzing past Mike as he ducked behind cover. Mike responded with calculated moves, using the terrain to his advantage. Finally, the confrontation came to a head near the edge of the frozen lake. Mike stood in the open, his rifle aimed at Victor, who held his pistol steady in return. "End of the line," Mike said. Victor's smile was thin, his breath visible in the icy air. "For one of us." Before either man could act, the ice beneath Victor's feet gave a loud crack. His eyes widened as the surface splintered, and he began to sink into the freezing water. Mike hesitated only a moment before lowering his weapon and stepping forward. Mike reached the edge of the broken ice, extending a hand toward Victor, who was struggling to stay afloat. "Take my hand," Mike said firmly. Victor's pride warred with his survival instincts. For a moment he looked as though he might refuse, but the icy water was merciless, and he finally grasped Mike's outstretched hand. With a grunt of effort, Mike hauled Victor onto the solid ice. The man collapsed, coughing and shivering as Mike stood over him. "You didn't have to come here," Mike said quietly. Victor looked up at him, his expression a mixture of disbelief and gratitude. "You could have let me drown." Mike's eyes hardened. "That's not who I am." By the time Trey and the remaining bikers arrived at the lake, they found Victor sitting by a small fire, wrapped in a blanket Mike had given him. Trey's swagger faltered when he saw the bruised and battered mercenary. "What happened?" Trey demanded. Victor glanced at him, then shook his head. "You didn't tell me who I was dealing with." He stood slowly, towering over Trey. "You're on your own." Victor walked past Trey without another word, climbing into his SUV and driving off into the night. Trey turned to Mike, who stood a short distance away, his rifle slung over his shoulder. "This isn't over," Trey spat, though his voice lacked its usual venom. Mike stepped closer, his presence intimidating. "It's over if you want to keep breathing." Trey stared at him for a long moment, then turned and motioned for his gang to leave. One by one, they mounted their bikes and rode off, their engines fading into the distance. The lake returned to silence as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon. Mike sat on the steps of his shack, watching the world slowly wake. He knew trouble might find him again someday, it always did, but for now, the bikers were gone, and the quiet had returned. As he sipped his coffee, he glanced at the photograph of his old unit resting on the table inside. "You taught me well," he murmured to the faces in the picture. The cold wind swept across the lake, carrying with it a sense of closure. Mike leaned back, letting the peace settle over him. For now, he was safe, and that was enough. If you enjoyed this story of resilience and justice, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Stay tuned for more thrilling tales every week. Hit the bell so you never miss an upload.